This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where it gives me great pleasure to introduce my special guest today from Buenos Aires, Laurence de Mello, who has done research on the Princess Diane death, a murder investigation into Dr. David Kelly, the escape of Martin Bormann for Berlin, and more. I am so delighted to have her here. Laurence, welcome to The Real Deal.
Thank you very much for having me, James. It's lovely to be here.
I am simply delighted. Let's begin with your research on Princess Diana, which you conducted for Mohamed Al-Fayed. Am I correct?
Well, what happened was I was an investigative journalist and a TV producer, and it came up actually quite by accident because I was at a luncheon. Well, actually, it was at a wedding, and I was talking to somebody about the Diana came up, and this lady actually worked for Mohamed at the time. And we were talking about the Diana thing, and I was saying how it concerned me, etc. And I was already involved with another couple of people sort of looking at the Diana situation, you know, sort of saying, well, this is a bit odd. We had a few meetings, etc., which I'll fill you in afterwards. And about 3 weeks later, I received a call from Harrods, and I was requested to come and have a meeting with Mohamed, which I did. And I went to the meeting, and obviously I imagined what it was about, although the phone call didn't tell me. And I had a meeting with him and conducted a few meetings after that on how one could approach supporting the investigation outside of the criminal investigation.
And of course, many of us suspect that the royal family was extremely unhappy with her closeness to a Muslim, and the idea of his marrying Diana would have filled them with horror, which has led.
Well, you hear this so frequently, James. But my personal view has got nothing to do with the concerns about members of the royal family, about Dodi Al Fayed, the Muslim connection. I really don't believe it's got anything to do with that, and I think it's more to do with the fact that Diana, like Mother Teresa of Calcutta, anything that Diana said was front page news. I mean, she was the most famous woman in the world at the time of her death. And you probably remember, and your listeners will remember, that she was getting very involved in sort of political campaigns, not so much political as in far as governments go, but what they were up to. And she was a headliner for the anti-personal landmines, which were maiming many children in Africa, and she got involved in that, and she did a campaign, and as a result of her campaign she actually got the banning of anti-personal landmines. Now you have to look at that. Who was that going to affect? Anti-personal landmines, and the ones that produced the anti-personal landmines were not very happy about it, and that was principally the French and the British. So I think that really they realised that she was called very early on a loose cannon, and she started to get, so if it was a bit like John Lennon. I mean, John Lennon had a following and people listened to him. So if John said, let's have peace and let's ban the bomb, it was front page news, and that's where Diana was. So she became an enormous threat to the establishment and many big organizations and corporations, because they thought, oh my God, what's she going to do next? She has to go, and that's my opinion. But I don't know how many of your viewers are coherent with what happened, but we're talking about Diana, who was killed in a car crash on the 31st of August in 1997 in a tunnel in Paris, along with her lover, Dodi Al Fayed, who's the son of Mohamed Al Fayed, and of course the French driver Henri Paul, who worked for Mohamed at the Ritz Hotel. So you have to look at, first of all, the red flags, and my interest was, I'm also a close friend of Michael Cole, who was the spokesperson for Mohamed Al Fayed, and he was also a former BBC Royal correspondent for 11 years, so he knew his stuff. And also Michael and I had a few lunches, etc., and we'd talk about stuff, and I'd ask him questions, and he revealed information to me which started to sort of tip my ear. So I started to get a bit concerned, and I contacted a friend of mine who's in the press. His name is Scott Chisholm, and he was a big Sky News presenter, but he was also formerly a correspondent, war correspondent, big tough guy, and I needed somebody on board with me that I knew could also have my back. And I also brought in Jeffrey Robinson. Now, I don't know if you're aware of Jeffrey Robinson, who's the author who wrote The Laundryman, and it was about money laundering. He's an American author. And we had various meetings about the situation with Diana, and they were going to come on board with me to do this investigation. Because at the time, I was also presenting a series for British television. I was preparing and pitching to a network, which actually was probably one of the first conspiracy-type programs, and at the time they thought it was quite shocking, and it was entitled Conspiracy, Fact or Fiction. And I was compiling various sort of unsolved cases, and we would have analysed the Diana thing. Quite early on with the meetings, and we would meet at Waterloo Station, funny enough, in London, so we could have meetings, because we already were aware then, a lot of us that were working in sort of intelligence gathering, that our phones were not safe and places were not safe for email, etc. And quite early on, Jeffrey actually backed out the project, and he told me that his actual words were, "Laurence, you should drop this like a hot potato. I can't go near it. I've got to get away. I've got something I've got to write for the USA, and I can't be connected." So we lost him quite early on. I went in to see, I think the interesting thing is I went in to see Mohamed, and on the meeting there, I mean, he's a very generous man. He's a typical sort of Middle Eastern man, and this is very sad because he's also been scapegoated because he got involved with problems with the British Parliament years ago in a cash for questions scandal, where he gave a minister an envelope with money in it to ask questions in Prime Minister's question time, which is very normal for the Arabs. So I had a meeting with him, and we sat down and we spoke, and he said okay, and initially he offered to support me fully to make a documentary, and I said to him, Mr. Fayed, if you finance me in any way, whatever, it looks like this is just a propaganda machine for you, which I wasn't agreeing with. But I did say to him what I would require was his support in Paris, and that means somebody, a driver, a guerrilla if you want to call it, somebody to cover my back, and that was the deal. And he said to me, well, what you need to do is to go down and speak to my head of communications. Now, for legal reasons, I'm not allowed to mention his name on the air, because I will have my tail in jail in London, I'm sure. But I was sent down to meet this chap, and this is where things get really weird for me. The first meeting I went in there, and I had a list, and we started to chat, and he said, Mr. Fayed sent you down to me, and what is it that you need? And I proceeded to ask him questions, and they had a very big file, because Mohamed had already had many people trying to get information, because of course he lost his son in this accident. And I said to him, I started to ask very, very blatant questions, James, like, okay, I want the names and all the contact numbers for the CCTV companies in Paris. I would like the names of all the people that attended the princess in the ambulance. I would like the addresses of Henri Paul's parents, blah, blah, blah. And quite early on in these meetings, he became quite obstructive and said to me, you're asking an awful lot of questions. Nobody's asked me this before. And I said, well, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, is try to get together bits and pieces that was going to support me, investigating this case. On the third meeting, this gentleman then proceeded to obstruct everything that I did, James. He tried to obstruct my support in Paris. He didn't get me documents that I wanted. And then I was actually a little bit slow on that, because I should have done my homework. But to cut a long story short, it turns out that this chap used to work for Scotland Yard. He'd worked for Scotland Yard for about 20 years. And on my final meeting with him, he actually proceeded to give me a Masonic handshake as I said goodbye. So basically, I took that as, forget it, because we're here as well. So that did make me concerned, because I realized then that Mohamed's network, his organization, was infiltrated with intelligence personnel, British intelligence, or at least people that were actually giving information to British intelligence. So it was quite a difficult time because in the same week that I actually met Mohamed initially, my mother had a sudden death. I'm not suggesting it has any connection whatsoever, although other people have mentioned it.
Your mother died?
So
Your mother died?
my mother died. My mother died of a sudden death, yeah. I mean, she just
Was
died.
she in relatively good health?
Yeah, she was. It was a sudden death. And,
What was it attributed to? Was there an autopsy?
well, yeah, there was an autopsy, and of course, because anywhere in the UK, any sudden death, the body has to be subjected to an autopsy, and they said that she died from a pulmonary thrombosis, which was very, very shocking because she was in relatively good health. But I think I want to go back with the Diana thing. I think it's important that we look at the red flags from day one because so many. Sorry.
Well, yes. I want to do that, but it seems to me this communications director was obviously alarmed that you were going to do a thoroughgoing investigation, that you might actually get to the heart of the matter, figure out what happened, and he was going to do everything he could to suppress, obstruct, and deflect you. And that says to me he knew who was responsible and may even have played a key role in the entire matter.
Very, very possibly. And also it's very shocking to think the very man that Mohamed entrusted with directing the investigation, with coordinating with investigators and journalists, was actually obstructing everything that I requested. So that was quite shocking because then you say, where do you go from here, James? What do you do now? So any communications that I made with Mohamed, I knew were being controlled. I mean, what does one do? So I knew. Now, at the time, I was working at a television company at Pinewood Studios, and we were preferred producers for Nat Geographic and Discovery Channel, and we were undergoing 3 programs at the time. One of them was the history of the mafia. We were also looking at the Chinese mafia in London, the triads, and the Russian mafia with the uranium trafficking. Now, at the time, I started to get some threats. This was when I was meeting with Mohamed, etc., phone calls. And I was pretty sure it was about the Diana stuff because it was a very, very clipped British accent, a gentleman. And he would just, nothing particularly sinister, but he would just say to me, you've been a very, very busy girl. You're a busy girl. I say, who is this? He said, now come on, you're a very busy girl, and the phone would go down. Now this went on for a little while, and I mentioned to a couple of people, in fact I mentioned to Michael, I called Michael, who was still working for, or he had just resigned, but he was still connected close to Mohamed. And he said to me, Laurence, they're obviously on to you. So now the strangest thing was, I knew that I was at risk when I was dabbling with the Russians, uranium trafficking, etc. And out of the blue, I received a phone call from the police, the Metropolitan Police, and they said to me, we know that you've had threats, etc. Now, in retrospect, when you sit down now, at the time I had so much going on, you don't analyse how did you find this out. And they offered to put into my apartment in Ascot, in the United Kingdom, a panic button. Now, I don't know how panic buttons work in the USA, but they're generally reserved in the United Kingdom for witnesses, for very high-profile murder cases, etc. So what they'll do, the government will finance that person, that witness who could potentially be at risk, to have this equipment put into your apartment or your home, and they put bugs around it, and anything happens, you push this button and the SWAT team is there within, I don't know how many minutes. So of course the police came and they put in these buttons, but I never was really suspicious that it had anything to do with the mafia, because we had a deal with Cosa Nostra at the time. We were getting information. It was about the history of the mafia, and there were certain agreements, conditions that we would talk about certain things about the history of the mafia. They would give us the information directly from Cosa Nostra, but we would not go into territories such as the Vatican or whatever. So I was abiding by all those agreements. So I was pretty sure that it wasn't coming from them. I didn't think it was coming from the Chinese. So this alarm system was put into my house. And of course, at the time you don't think, but then I realise now it was put in probably by them so they could monitor everything that was going on. And shortly after, it got pretty hot. So I actually left the United Kingdom and I came to Argentina, and I've been living here ever since. Although I do go back and forth to the UK, obviously, for work. And a friend of mine, in fact, it was Michael Cole, I think it was in 2006, that he said to me, Laurence, I've spoken to a couple of members of the press, and I want to mention the death threats about when you were working on the Diana project. So that did come out in the press. And of course, it's like James Hewitt. If you remember James Hewitt, he was a major, he was the lover of Diana. Now, I met him years ago. Now, initially, when he sold her letters, of course, it was shocking. You know, we all said what a bloody cad he was.
Yes.
And that was really, really low. You don't do that. You don't sell out on information, personal information of a lady. And I actually once at a party, I was appalled that he'd got in, and I said, you know, you should even be here. But then afterwards, a couple of years later, I actually wrote to him, and then he called me, and I apologised, and I realised why he did it, James. The reason he sold and published those letters was because that was his safety card. Because while you have a secret, and you have it, and it's a cult, you are at risk. So that's why you have to get it out.
Yes, I agree completely. But many of us believe, of course, that he's the father of Prince Harry.
Well, I would say that you're on the right track, but I'm not going to discuss that in public because that's out of limit. But certainly, yeah, I would certainly say that there is great reason to believe that.
Anyone who has important information about a high crime or misdemeanor is far better off making it public. Then there's far less reason to silence them. In fact, after the information is public, silencing them, taking them out, reinforces its significance. So there's far less motive to assassinate someone for their political knowledge.
Exactly, but the problem is what happens with us journalists, James, as you probably know, when we're doing an investigation, and also it's our livelihood. So we're trying to accumulate information, and if you come out in the press, you blow your investigation. So you're sort of it's a
prematurely, yes, if you do it too early.
So how far do you go? And I've had a lot of people pushing, particularly on the work that I've done on Bormann, sort of come out. But I want to go back. Let's have a look at the red flags. I don't know if any of because obviously, you know, not everybody is coherent with what actually happened. And I would say the red flags of the incident of the Diana crash. Now, as we know, there was a criminal investigation in France, which they found a verdict of unlawful killing, which was actually turned into a film, which was banned by the French government, saying that Henry Paul was under the influence of alcohol. He was also taking antidepressant drugs, and the combination of the antidepressants and the alcohol were what led to this fatal crash.
Blame it on the driver. Blame it on the driver.
Blame it on the driver, of course. Now, let's go back. Now, it's been told, now it's come out also in the last few years, it was suggested at the time, and I'd also heard it, that the night before, or 2 days before the fatal incident, there were several leading figures of British, which is MI6, at the British Embassy in Paris. Now, I heard that from various sources, but in the last 3 years, it's come out actually from a Russian author who was briefed by Russian intelligence that actually they were following these chaps. So it's also been confirmed now by, you know, I mean, obviously, every intelligence agency watches the other intelligence agency, particularly the Russians watch where MI6 are, and they watch where the CIA are, blah, blah, blah. But it's been confirmed that there were Russians actually rather tipped off that there were these MI6 chaps in Paris. So we know that. And also, what else do we have that went on? Now, let's have a look at the CCTV that night. Now, that was one of my major questions at the time, which I couldn't get the information from this chap who was working for Fayed. Now, the route from the Ritz Hotel all the way to the Alma Tunnel. Now, you know, I don't know how it is in the States, but in Europe, they say in London that you are photographed on average 385 times just by walking around London by CCTV cameras. There's not one bit of footage of the car that left the Ritz Hotel to the time of the Alma Tunnel. And it was said that they were not working that night, there were blowouts, etc. But interestingly enough, people have come forward in the years since the incident that they actually received speeding tickets because of cameras taken off them. So it was very selective. There is not one shot of the car, the Mercedes that carried the Princess of Wales, from the Ritz Hotel to the tunnel. So that's
isn't it obvious they went back and stripped all that video? They got rid of it. I mean, it was done
Well,
retroactively.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we say why were they either blacked out, well, we know now they can't have been blacked out because they actually took shots of other people that were speeding. So obviously it was selective. They eliminated. So there are absolutely no photographs of the chase. Now we have also the situation of the Mercedes. Now the Mercedes-Benz, people familiar with Mercedes, I mean they're brilliant cars. I mean they're made for speed. I mean they're tough. And now this particular car, which was one of the fleet that was owned by Mohamed Fayed, and apparently it had just recently returned from having a service and had been away for 6 weeks, this car.
6 weeks? 6 weeks?
6 weeks.
What do they do? Rebuilding the car? I mean, that's ridiculous. It's 6 hours.
No, what I've heard, 6 weeks. I can't pin down and get the actual details.
6 hours might be reasonable. I own an old Mercedes myself. And of course, it's designed so the engine will drop to the ground to absorb the impact in the case of a collision.
Well, there you go. Now, we know something else about these sort of good luxury cars. Now, ABS braking, which is the automatic braking system. Now, it was said at the inquiry, the initial investigation, when they were trying to say that the car was going at very high speeds and it skidded and it glided off the road. Now, we know, James, that cars with ABS braking, when they skid, they don't actually skid. They sort of skid jolt, because the braking system is made that it doesn't jam.
Yes.
It goes and it releases, it goes and releases. So how could you possibly have a 40 or 50 meter solid skid mark from a Mercedes of that category?
Yeah.
So you'd say, well, there's something wrong here. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the brakes were jammed, or there was something within the car that there was a jamming system.
I would suggest they had taken that time to make the car something that could be controlled remotely to create the crash, obviously a sign of deliberate planning for her death.
Okay, and also, it's also noted that just before Henry Paul, when they were waiting, you can see that, there was about which car they were going to take. And he was instructed to change cars. Now, he was told at the last minute which car that he had to take, and they had it parking out the back of the Ritz so that Diana can get out to avoid all the press that were in the front of the hotel. So this car was substituted at the last minute for the car that Henry normally drives. Now, that's also interesting. So I don't want to come on as a big conspiracy, because we have this terrible label today, and I put it across recently on another radio interview. This has become a stigma. And it's rather like the key word, like you're anti-Semitic if you say anything contra Israel. So they stick this label on you. So if you raise any questions, it's a way to neutralize any sort of...
Yes, the CIA introduced the phrase to attack those who were critical of the Warren Commission.
Okay, well, I feel that totally about the tag conspiracy theory. So I like to say we are
Conspiracies are as common as apple pie. What would Shakespeare have had to write about where there were not plots against the kings and queens of England? For God's sake. I mean, this is ridiculous. To be anti-conspiracy is to consign yourself to know nothing, to not understanding the events of the world.
Yeah. Let's go back now to the CCTV. Now, I want to also mention that the family of Henry Paul, now, they went very, very quiet, as you know. Now, the family of Henry Paul also requested photographs of the car, where it went, where it travelled, what speed it was going, and they were refused. They were told there was absolutely no photographs. There was no footage whatsoever. But James, you and I, if we were speeding on there would certainly be lots of photographs of us. Right, so we've got the ABS braking, the skidding. Now let's now go down to a bit more detail, because we don't have too much
Laurence,
time.
before we do that, we have to take our first break. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm so pleased to have you here. This is Jim Fetzer with my very special guest from Buenos Aires, Laurence de Mello. We'll be right back.